Today we're going to build a pantry. There'll be plenty of room for your canned goods and your dry goods. The inside is made out of melamine. It's tough and it's easy to clean. I've installed a couple lights so that you'll be able to see everything easily. The outside of the cabinet is made out of recycled chestnut. And these are punched metal panels. Not only are they decorative, but they help to ventilate the cabinet. These are made out of copper, and I'll even show you how to make those today, right here in the new Yankee Workshop.
The new Yankee Workshop features the craftsmanship of Norm Abram and is made possible by
Porter Cable, building performance and innovation into woodworking tools since 1906. Available through woodworking dealers, hardware stores, and home centers everywhere. Porter Cable, the woodworker's choice.
Minwax. For over 90 years, we've made a complete line of interior stains, protective finishes, and wood care products designed to turn your house into a beautiful home. Minwax makes and keeps wood beautiful.
and by
Delta Woodworking Machinery. A full line of precision shop tools available at woodworking dealers, hardware stores, and home centers. Delta, building on tradition.
This melamine is great stuff. It comes in different thicknesses and in different colors. It's a medium density laminate over particle board. It's relatively inexpensive, and with this good tough finish, I don't have to paint the cabinet when I'm done building it, and it's easy to clean later on. If there are any disadvantages, it's a little bit heavy, and when you cut it, the dust can be aggressive, so I like to wear a particle mask. Here are the pieces for the inside of our pantry. I need to square them up and cut them to length. Now, one more thing. It is important to have the right blade to cut this material to prevent chip out. The manufacturer has made a blade with very sharply angled carbide tips. And if you look real close, the tip, every once in a while, is a little bit higher so that it scores the material before it cuts through it. Now, before we use any power tools, let's take a moment to talk about shop safety. Be sure to read, understand, and follow all the safety rules that come with your power tools. Knowing how to use your power tools properly will greatly reduce the risk of personal injury. And remember this, there is no more important safety rule than to wear these safety glasses. Whenever I have to square up large pieces like this, I like to use my panel cutter. And every piece comes out perfectly square. All it is a piece of plywood with a stop across the front and a little runner in the bottom that rides in the miter slot of my table saw. It's a tool that I couldn't do without here in the shop. Now, with the square end down at this end, I just simply hook my tape on, measure the length of the piece that I want, mark it, and we'll trim it off. At the lower front edge of each side panel, I've laid out a notch for the toe kick. All I'm using is my circular saw and my square as a guide to get a nice straight cut. Now I'll just complete it with my jigsaw. In modern cabinets today, one common feature is adjustable shelves. Now, there's a lot of different ways to accomplish adjustable shelves. We've surface-mounted standards with clips. We've recessed standards into the sides of the cabinet and used clips. But there's no simpler method than the one I'm using today, using these small paddle clips that fit into 1/4-inch holes, 1 inch apart. To cut the holes, I'm using this jig. It's a thick piece of aluminum with a clamp that holds the piece to the side panel. There are also pins which adjust the distance from the edge of the panel to the center of the hole. And today I'm using a 2-inch distance. Now, to actually make the holes, I'm using my router with a collar that fits right into the jig. And inside, there's a 1/4-inch bit that makes the hole. It works great. Okay, that's the first series of holes. I started right in the center of my panel, aligning with the center of the jig. Now, to extend the holes so that they go further to the top and bottom edge of the cabinet, I just slide the jig down, take a piece of dowel, stick it in one of the holes that I've already drilled, and just continue along. Now, here's a little different setup. This is the back panel for the pantry. I've made it out of 1/2 inch thick melamine. I could have used 3/4 inch, but I'm trying to lighten the unit up a little bit. The shelves in the pantry unit are going to carry a lot of weight, so I think it's important to have a series of holes for clips right down the middle of the back panel. So I've clamped the straight edge in place and positioned my jig so that I can make all the holes for the additional clips. Here I've set one of the side panels on the bench, and I've ripped a piece of scrap plywood to make a cleat that goes right at the bottom edge, and that's going to support the bottom shelf. I'll just attach it with some glue and screws. Here I've positioned the sides and the bottom shelf on my workbench. I'm putting a bead of glue where that shelf is going to meet the cleat that we just installed. I'll clamp everything in place, and I'll secure it with some screws. The real key to assembling these melamine panels is to use the right screw. It's a very heavy shank screw, heavier just below the head and a little thinner at the threads. Now, you need the right drill to make the pilot hole. It's a step drill. The diameter of the drill is larger up at the top and narrower at the bottom. So the first thing I do is drill the pilot hole to the right depth. And then just drive the screw until it's nice and snug. Now, the top panel gets attached using the same methods. Now, here I've applied a bead of glue all around the edge of the back of our cabinet, and I'm going to set the 1/2 inch panel down and staple it in place. To wrap the melamine core of our pantry, I'm going to use some antique chestnut. So I went up to my local used wood supplier and picked up a whole bunch of boards. Now, these pieces of chestnut have been cut out of some old beams, and they are just beautiful. Still have wormholes in some of them. And because they've been sawn out of beams, they're a little bit thicker than what I need. So the first step is to run these pieces through my surface planer until I get them down to the thickness that I want. Well, the surface plane does a great job on the flat surfaces. Now I want to turn my attention to the edges. Now, these boards are pretty straight, but I want to make sure they're absolutely straight and square to the surface. And the best tool to do that is my joiner. So I'll make a couple passes along one edge. With one edge nice and straight and square on all of the boards, the next step is to rip the other edge so it's parallel. Place the jointed edge against the fence and run it through. I'll have to adjust the fence for each board because they're all different widths. Okay, now I'm going to run that freshly sawn edge through the joiner. Well, that's pretty good. Now, here are 3 of the boards that are going to become one of the sides of the pantry. I've just double-checked to make sure that all the joints are nice and tight, and I've actually laid out marks about every 10 inches on center, and I'll cut slots at those locations for biscuits. The biscuits will help line the boards up, and it'll strengthen the joint. Now, the hand position when using the plate joiner is to hold down on this fence so that it's tight to the surface of the board, and then just push the motor in to make the cut. These biscuits are actually made out of beechwood, and they're cut in such a way that it gives us maximum strength across the joint, and the moisture of the glue actually causes them to swell up a bit, making them really hold. The idea here is to push down in the middle of the panel so that it's tight to the clamp when I apply the pressure, so that it doesn't bow up. While the panels cure, let's work on the face frame. There are bits of wood that are going to go around the cabinet. 2 narrow stiles and a rail that goes across the top. Often on old cabinets like this, you'll see a little bit of a bead detail that runs around the inside of the face frame. So I've set up my router table to make that. Now the bit that I'm using is like this one. Just has a half-round cutter and a ball bearing at the top. The ball bearing is if you were using a freehand router. Since I have a fence, I'll use that to guide the piece. I've installed a feather board on the top edge to hold it down to the table, and I've installed one more feather board to keep the piece tightly up against the fence. Okay, that's perfect. Okay, now that takes care of the bead on that top rail. Let me show you the joint I'm going to make between the rail and the stile. Here's a sample. On the rail, I'm simply going to miter the bead. On the stile, it's a little bit different. I first have to tip the saw to 45 degrees to make the miter cut. Then I'll square it back up again and nibble away the rest of the material. All right, our pieces fit together pretty well. Now, to make the connection between the rail and the stile, I'm going to use a pocket screw joint. This is the back of the rail, which will get a slot and a pilot hole through which a screw goes to secure the joint. And it's unbelievable how strong this joint is. Now, to make the pockets, I'm using this pocket production machine. Inside, underneath, there is a router that has a straight cutting bit to make the pocket, and then there's also a drill bit that makes that pilot hole. I simply clamp the piece in place and cut the pocket. Well, now I'm ready to go back to those glued up side panels I made earlier, sand them out, and cut them to size. Now, would you ever know that these are 3 boards joined together? Came out pretty well. As I attach these wooden side panels to the melamine carcass, I have to take a couple things into consideration. The melamine is very stable. It's not going to expand and contract very much. But these solid wood panels will move quite a bit. So I've drilled a series of holes through the cabinet. The hole near the front edge is just big enough to receive the screw. I want to secure this front edge because it's going to receive the face frame. Now, the other 2 holes I've drilled at 1/4 inch diameter, and I'll center the screw in the hole, and that should allow me enough movement. Now, you'll also notice that I'm using some finished washers with my screws, and that's so I won't blow through the melamine as I tighten them up. Now, that's not going anywhere. Now, I did notch out the side panels for the toe kick detail. And if you look over at the other side, you can see that the chestnut is about 7/8 of an inch in front of the melamine. And that's so that when I drop in a 3/4 inch thick toe kick, I get a little reveal here of about 1/8 of an inch. And I think that looks a lot better than trying to make it flush. I also put a cleat of plywood on the underside of this bottom shelf because I don't want to attach the toe kick from the inside, and I also don't want it to move in if you kick against it. So that'll take care of those problems. Now here I'm beginning to cut some slots for biscuits in the side panel. I'm going to cut a corresponding slot in the back of my face frame. I don't want to use nails to attach the frame. I just want to use the glue and the biscuits. All right, let's see how we did. It's pretty good. Now I'll put a few clamps on to hold it in place while the glue sets up. Well, it took quite a few clamps to get this face frame all set in place, but it looks pretty good. Now, tomorrow we'll make some doors, some shelves, and we'll even figure out a way to put a couple lights inside of this cabinet. Well, good morning. I got started today removing the clamps that I had used to set the face frame in place. I've sanded the edges and the corners, And you know, it takes a lot of extra time to make this bead detail on the face frame, but it's worth it. It's a nice look. Let's get started today by building the doors for our pantry. And here I have a sample of the joint that I'm using between the rails and the stiles. It's a mortise and tenon joint. And on the back side of the rails and stiles, there's a rabbet. That's going to receive the wooden panel at the bottom and the copper panels at the top. That's the first step that I have to do. So I've set up my stacked dado head cutter with a sacrificial strip, and I've set up this feather board to hold the piece down tight to the table as I run it through. Now here's a sample of that mortise that I'm trying to make. It's right at the edge of the rabbet, and it's about 1.25 inches deep. To make it, I'm using my dedicated mortising machine. It's set up with a 1/4-inch chisel, and there's a drill bit in the center. The drill bit removes most of the material, and the chisel squares it up. And then there's a hole down that holds the piece in place so that it doesn't lift up as I remove the chisel. Now, I'm ready to start forming the tenons, but because of the rabbet, I have an offset setup. The shoulder on the face side is further in than the shoulder on the back side. I've set up to make the shoulder cut on the face side first. The saw is about 1/4 inch above the table. The fence is in the right position, and it's pulled back so that as I push the piece through, I won't get any kickbacks. Now I'm going to use my sample to raise the blade up to make the haunch cut on the tenon. The fence setup has not changed. To complete the tenons, I need to make the cheek cuts. And to do that, I'm using my tenoning jig. Now this holds the piece securely in place as I run it through the blade. There'll be 2 setups on the blade height because of the offset tenons. I'm cutting the inside cheek first. Before I assemble the right-hand door, I've just put a bead down one of the stiles, using the same setup that I used to do the face frame. With a little bit of glue in the mortise and on the tenon, you can just slide the pieces together, and when they're all set, we'll clamp it. Before I set this aside to dry, I'm going to install the bottom wooden panel. It's a piece of 1/4-inch thick chestnut that I ran through my surface planer, and it's sized to be a little bit smaller than the opening so it can expand and contract freely. It'll be held in place with these little cleats, also made out of chestnut. No glue. I'll just secure these with some brads. Well, while those doors cook for a while, let's turn our attention to the shelves. Now, I could have the shelf come straight across at the front, but because I'm lighting the inside of the cabinet, I made a slight cutout. For the first one, I just laid it out, cut it with my jigsaw, and then made it smooth with my drum sander. But now that I have one, there's an easier way. I just trace the outline, and first I'll make a cut with the jigsaw, staying proud of the line. Now I'm going to take the template, the original, and put it underneath the one that I just cut with the jigsaw, and clamp it to the workbench. Okay, now I just want to make sure that the front and the end of the shelves are even. And once that's done, I turn to my router, which I've set up with a flush trimming bit. The ball bearing is going to ride on the template down below, and the cutter is going to make an exact duplicate. Here's one of the finished shelves, and I've covered the exposed flake board with a piece of thin oak veneer. I would have liked chestnut, but they don't make it in chestnut. The veneer comes in a big roll. It's a little over 3/4 inch wide, and it has a heat-activated adhesive on the back. Now, you can put this on with an iron, but I found that with these curves, it's a little bit better to use a heat gun. I also found that I should start in the middle. Now I just trim off any excess with this little razor, and then I just sand it to round over the edge a bit. For the last several minutes, I've been positioning the doors in the carcass, leaving a nice even margin all the way around the edges. And I'm getting ready to mortise for the hinges. Now, the hinge that I'm going to use is this drop pin hinge. It's actually manufactured by the same company that makes my plate joiner. they've made the radius of the hinge the same as the radius as the cutter head. So when I position the plate joiner over my layout lines and plunge it into the work, it'll make a mortise in the door and in the style for the hinge. With the hinge, I just slide it into the mortise, use a centering punch, give me a pilot for the screw, and then just install the screws. All right, that takes care of the hinge on the door. Now there's one more thing I want to do to this carcass. All right, well, I've just drilled two 2¼ inch holes that are going to receive these low voltage lights that I bought as a kit. Okay, well, with the doors complete, I'm now ready to make the copper panels. Well, here's one of the panels that I've already completed. What do you think? It's a nice geometric design. And what we did is we wrote away to a company that specializes in metalware. They sell all different types of tin and copper, either aged or new. And we told them the size of our opening. They sent us a pattern of the design that we wanted. And they sent us the sheets of copper already cut to size, along with the tools necessary for this particular design. Now, they tell us to start out by cleaning the piece with mineral spirits, which I've already done, and then to take the piece of copper and just wrap it in this tissue paper. Now I'll just apply the pattern and center it on the panel. They recommend that you use particle board as a substrate to punch the tin, and find a fresh area for every panel that you punch. Now I just want to set it on here and use the small punch and just hit each corner. Now to keep the panel from moving around as I punch it, I'm just going to take these tacks and put one in each corner. Now this pattern is made up of a series of holes that I make with the punch and then slits that I make with the chisel. I found that if I did a whole bunch of the punches first and then switched to the chisel, that minimized changing tools. It takes a while, and you got to concentrate. Okay, now I think it's time to switch over to the chisel. Now I found that with the chisel you have to strike it a little bit harder. Well, the last bit of woodworking is to put this molding around the top of the cabinet. It gives it another shadow line. Now it's the same bead that I used on the face frame and on the doors. Now with that complete, a little bit of sanding, and this piece is ready for the finishing room. To protect our antique chestnut and bring out the beauty of the wood, I'm using a clear gloss polyurethane. I'm going to put one coat on, let it dry for about 3 hours, and then sand it lightly with 220 grit sandpaper. Then I'll tack it off, removing all the dust, and apply a second coat. 3 hours after that, I'll follow the same procedure and do a third coat. That'll give us plenty of protection and durability. Well, there it is, with a couple coats of polyurethane, which really brings out the beauty of this chestnut. The copper panels have been installed, and even the lighting package. Now, this is going to be a very useful storage unit.